Canada, June 1777. British troops assemble on the banks of the Richelieu River. They plan a major attack on the United States from the north. It is an enormous force, led by the dashing, theatrical, larger-than-life General John Burgoyne.
I can't ask for anything better than this army of professionals. The mob of undisciplined provincials won't have a chance against them. I have instructed the officers to count on the bayonet. The rebels can't stand up against the bayonet. They hide behind trees, relying on their rifle pieces.
Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne was a socialite general, a young man about town, charming, innumerable friends, very competent playwright. Burgoyne, better playwright than general. His farces are still worth listening to.
In England, Horace Walpole, a political insider, comments.
Ah, yes, Burgoyne the pompous. He's the natural son of Lord Bingley, but he did not inherit any of his estate. He's a gambler. Some say he cheats, but in fact he plays very well. I heard him speak in Parliament. He never impressed me much with his brilliance, but he's a useful commander. He feeds the press and the public with many exciting accounts of his exploits. He's as noisy as Howe is quiet.
Burgoyne's master plan is for two British armies to seize control of the Hudson River, one attacking down from Canada, the other up from New York City. This would isolate New England from the rest of the colonies.
This is the famous Hudson, Lake Champlain, Richelieu corridor, which is one of the most fought-over places on Earth. Everybody knew that if you could get control of it, you then were master of the northeastern United States. And it was particularly important for the British to have control of it, because then they could use Quebec, Montreal at one end and New York at the other as their two main bases, and just shoot up and down the corridor. And New England and most of New York would be cut off from the rest of what we'll call the United States. It wasn't yet the United States, but the rest of the United States.
A young soldier fighting with Burgoyne, Sergeant Roger Lamb, keeps a diary of his experiences.
This is going to be a critical expedition. General Burgoyne tells us to get ready. Ready for hard work. Ready to give our lives. We must not retreat.
The soldiers board ships, and Burgoyne's armada sets sail. Their destination is Albany. In New York City, General Howe is making preparations for some large operation. George Washington is with the main American army in New Jersey, watching and waiting for Howe's next move.
General Howe's strange maneuvers puzzle us beyond measure. One day his ships seem ready to head up the Hudson. The next day they seem headed toward Philadelphia. I'm completely perplexed as to what his real design is. Our conduct must be governed by his. If we can keep General Howe at bay, I think any success that Mr. Burgoyne has will be partial and temporary.
Burgoyne's army travels down Lake Champlain, a smooth 3-week sail. On July 1st, they arrive at what everyone considers the single largest obstacle of the campaign, Fort Ticonderoga. The fort dominates a narrowing in the lake. No invaders can get their boats past this point without coming within range of the fort's deadly cannon. This stronghold is being defended by 2,000 heavily armed Americans. Overlooking Ticonderoga is Mount Defiance. It is steep and rugged. Nobody imagines that it can be fortified. But in an extraordinary feat of military engineering, Burgoyne's soldiers managed to cut a path up its back slope. The following morning, the Americans are stunned to see British guns trained down on them. they realize that the fort is indefensible and flee for their lives.
It was a very emotional deal for the Americans. Fort Ticonderoga stood as the great bastion to stop invasions from the north. And suddenly, the British were able to breach it. And this had a tremendous impact on America. The tie had broken, and the British were streaming down the Champlain Valley. It looked like all was lost.
Torrents of success. The opposition is swept away, all of us. Officers and men see the end in sight. Albany within our grasp. New England finally submitting to British rule.
To Lord Germain, nothing can now stop us on our passage to Albany. Credit for this victory goes to my officers and superior equipment. My merit is small. After we take Albany, I request the King's leave to return to England. My constitution is not fitted for the American winter.
In London, an ecstatic King George III gets the news of the fall of Ticonderoga.
I beat them. I have beat the rebels.
As Burgoyne begins to approach more populated areas, he too makes an appeal to the inhabitants.
This crusade is to restore to you the blessings of legal government. You Americans are invited to join us in this glorious task. Civilians will not be bothered if you remain quietly in your homes and make available to our army forage for our animals.
Burgoyne's words have the opposite effect.
Burgoyne talked too much and wrote too much. I mean, it was a very high-profile invasion that he conducted, thanks to his own style of conducting it, and in fact helped to solidify American motivation to resist him.
For nearby farmers and townspeople, the advancing British army has suddenly become very real. The Americans start to assemble into their militia units. The Englishman, Nicholas Creswell, is finding his travel plans disrupted.
New recruits are collecting in every town on the continent. In a few months, the rascals will be stronger than ever. Even the preachers have turned their pulpits into drums, summoning all to arms among this cursed rabble. Damn them all!
Burgoyne is beginning to encounter scattered opposition. He issues a more ominous proclamation.
To those who continue this stubborn rebellion will come the vengeance of a state against its willful outcasts. The Indian forces under my direction will wreak devastation, famine, and every imaginable horror on those who resist us.
Even though Indians and colonists often got along, trading with one another and forming alliances, most colonial Americans were terrified of the native peoples who were at their borders. These Indians were very effective warriors. They could strike over long distances, suddenly, swiftly, and then disappear again into the forest and head home. As these stories developed over time, they became embellished, they became exaggerated, and they achieved a currency in colonial America that made Indians very feared warriors indeed. General Burgoyne, knowing this fear, used it as a weapon of terror and publicized his Indian allies in northern New York.
But Burgoyne's strategy backfires. In late July, a young woman, Jane McCrae, engaged to a British officer, is brutally murdered.
No one will ever know for certain how Jane McCrae was killed and by whom. But the Americans knew from the very first news of this killing how they would use it. They would use it to great effect against the British by playing upon people's fears of these Indian warriors.
The murder of Jane McCrae is retold and embellished in melodramatic paintings and exaggerated newspaper accounts. The story spreads throughout New England.
The Americans, who were masters of propaganda, said, here is a woman, a beautiful woman, who was a fiancée of one of the officers with Burgoyne. And Burgoyne's Indians scalped her. Now, if this is what's being done to the women, who are allied with his own forces, what are they going to do with your wives and your children when they get here? And they're coming. And the New England troops just turned out in droves.
The swelling American forces slow Burgoyne's progress. The rebels block the way with huge trees. They burn bridges and divert streams, turning Burgoyne's path into a swamp.
The enemy are at home here. They know this damn countryside, so they have a huge advantage. Every step for us, scouting, reconnoitering, brings new perils. Everywhere there are streams to cross and bridges to build. It takes a week to advance 1 mile.
The Americans do everything they can to impede his advance, to slow it, to make it expensive. And it is very slow, and it is very expensive in terms of labor and in terms of the British supplies consumed. The more you can stretch out the march of the army in time, the more of its own supplies that it's bringing with it are being consumed by that army.
These supplies. For every hour I devote to figuring out how this army must fight, I have to spend 20 hours trying to figure out how to keep it fed.
Campaigning before the coming of the railway and before the coming of preserved food was a nightmare for generals, and it was their greatest problem. Fighting battles was easy. Supplying the armies while you marched them to the place where you were going to fight the battle was an absolute endless scenario of difficulties for the general.
In late August, General Howe's armada is sighted on Delaware Bay. His plan is to take Philadelphia, the capital, first, and then meet up with Burgoyne. The war is now advancing on two fronts. Washington and his army rush to Philadelphia's defense. Outside of Albany, members of the Northern militia are gathering to oppose Burgoyne. They are led by the very popular general, Horatio Gates. John Adams writes home from Philadelphia.
My dearest friend, Congress has sent Gates to take charge of the army in the North. This is what people from New England wanted. Now let them turn out in force. A fleet of 100 ships was seen off the Delaware Capes. Where, how this scourge of God and plague of mankind is going to land, nobody can guess. But don't be anxious for my safety. When Howe comes to Philadelphia, I shall run away, I suppose, with the rest of Congress.
Dearest friend, we have not heard any news from the North. I long for some grand, important action somewhere. Burgoyne with his grand airs must be humbled to the dust. The call for men is hurting the farm. My head Negro has left in the middle of haying. What will I do now? I am not going to complain. If I have neither molasses, nor sugar, nor tea, nor coffee, I can live without them. As long as what I enjoy I share with my dearest partner, and with liberty.
Outside of Albany, the militia continue to pour in, reinforced by the soldiers who have fled Fort Ticonderoga. Burgoyne continues his advance. It takes him another month to reach Saratoga. From here, it seems easy. A road leads straight to his objective, Albany, 20 miles to the south. But there is a new crisis. Burgoyne's Indian scouts are deserting the army.
Once the campaign begins to be too long, and I think they probably sense before anyone else does, Americans or British, that this is going badly, they begin to drift away. They disappear. So by the time he gets into the real combat zone of this invasion, he's lost his screening force.
Without his Indian guides to serve as his eyes and ears, Burgoyne has no way of knowing where the enemy is or how strong their forces are. The American Army, with its citizen soldiers of the New England Militia, is now over 7,000 strong. They are encamped on a piece of land called Freeman's Farm, overlooking the only road to Albany. And now they wait. September 19th. Burgoyne's troops march into a clearing at Freeman's Farm. They see no American soldiers. Suddenly, from the surrounding woods, they hear a strange sound. Turkey gobbling. It is the secret code of Daniel Morgan's Rifle Corps. Their order, in flagrant breach of 18th century military etiquette, is to aim directly at the officers.
Several Americans place themselves in high trees, and when they see a British officer's uniform, they kill him by deliberately aiming at his person. Men, and particularly officers, drop on either side of me. The Americans too have heavy losses, but more and more of their reinforcements keep arriving.
Burgoyne is astounded. Not only has a huge army assembled from nowhere, worse, the Americans, whom he has called a mob of undisciplined provincials, are clearly able to fight. Burgoyne sends a frantic message to General Howe, who he assumes is still in New York.
The American army now between us and Albany outnumbers us. No operation, my lord, has yet been undertaken from New York to support us. There is no movement up the Hudson River. I never dreamed I would be left to make my way through this hostile countryside, surrounded by enemies, without any cooperation from New York. Burgoyne.
What was supposed to happen with Burgoyne and Howe in 1777 is a puzzle which historians have been teasing out ever since it happened, and it's still very far from clear. If Howe had seriously thought that Burgoyne's campaign depended on him, it wouldn't have been very difficult to make a detachment up the Hudson River to help him. Conversely, if Burgoyne had imagined that his success depended on what Howe was doing, one supposes he might have taken some steps to inform Howe of exactly where he intended to be and when, which he didn't.
Howe was having troubles of his own. His advance toward Philadelphia is meeting with stubborn resistance from Washington and the main American army. Howe fights and wins a fierce battle at Brandywine Creek. Both sides suffer heavy losses. Howe finally captures Philadelphia on September 26th. It is a hollow victory. Congress has fled.
In European terms, the capital is the seat of government, the seat of the monarch, and the mere threat of the loss of the capital would bring a government to terms. The same thinking must have influenced Howe's constant feeling that he ought to get Philadelphia, that Philadelphia was somehow the capital, whatever that might mean in America, and that this would perhaps be a solution and lead to a political settlement. But on the Americans went.
At Saratoga, Burgoyne is outnumbered 2-1, and the American forces continue to grow. He holds an urgent meeting with his generals. Baron von Riedesel and Simon Fraser urge him to retreat across the Hudson. Instead, Burgoyne orders another direct assault on the American army to force a passage to Albany.
Burgoyne was a gambler by temperament, loved gambling all his life. His temperament was not cautious. And as far as he was concerned, he was trying to execute a strategy which could work and which it was worth trying.
October 7th, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The British begin their attack. The American response is weak. General Gates refuses to leave his tent.
The minute Burgoyne showed up, Gates didn't know what to do. Gates's strength was as a paper shuffler. He could administer and work at a desk. He just was not a fighter. Once the battle began, he was worthless, literally, on the battlefield.
Seizing the initiative in the field and leading the counterattack is the most brilliant and fearless general of the American Army, Benedict Arnold.
Arnold rides up and points his sword at the enemy. Morgan's men, urged on by Arnold, hurl themselves against the English and Germans with deadly fire from their rifles. I can't describe the bravery of Arnold on this battlefield. He's inspired with the fury of a demon.
3 years later, Arnold will become the Revolution's most famous traitor. But in 1777, at Freeman's Farm, he is its most heroic fighter. Arnold's horse is shot from under him. Seriously wounded, Arnold rallies his men to carry on the attack.
Arnold, as a field general, was electric to the men. And when he was there, they would do things no one else could get them to perform. And here he broke the line, the last line that Burgoyne had. With that, Burgoyne had to start to retreat.
The British officers, ignoring their own personal danger, lead their troops in one last stand.
General Fraser is hit. He was shot by a rifleman hiding in a tree. Everyone, from Burgoyne to the lowliest private, is stunned. He's faint, and he's losing blood. He asked if our army is defeated. We told him no. He appeared for the moment, pleased.
About 3 in the afternoon, we are waiting for our dinner guests. Instead, they bring in General Fraser on a litter. They clear the table and use it as a bed for the general. The ball has gone through the general's bowels. All night I hear him lying there, groaning. All fatal ambition, and poor General Burgoyne, and my poor wife. He dies at 8 o'clock the next morning.
The supply of rebels is inexhaustible. It's like Hydra's head. When you cut one snake off, 7 more spring up in its place. For 3 weeks, no one has slept through the night. We are running low on rations. To keep spirits up, I have ordered the distribution of the last 12 barrels of rum.
October 10th, 2 in the afternoon. We take refuge in the cellar. My children lie on the earth with their heads on my lap. The sounds of the battle are growing louder, and I am sitting in the corner, trembling. I am more dead than alive. Not so much because of mine own danger, as from worrying about my husband. Of all the women whose husbands have been killed or wounded, shall I be the only fortunate one?
We hear this huge sound, like the howling of dogs. At first we think it's a trick of the enemies, so we send out a detachment to reconnoitre. They come back and report to us. It's wolves. One sets up a cry when it finds a corpse. Then the others join it in that hideous sound as they rip it apart. The howling gets louder and louder.
On October 17th, in a field near Saratoga, the British lay down their arms. Burgoyne's entire army is taken prisoner. Gone are all his dreams of easy victory, honor, and glory.
General Gates met Burgoyne at the entrance to the camp. The fortune of war, General Gates, has made me your prisoner. Burgoyne drew his sword and handed it to Gates, who received it with a bow and returned it to its owner.
In their best military uniforms, with regimental colors flying, the British prisoners march into a clearing. They see, for the first time, the face of their conquerors. Row upon row of plainly dressed citizen soldiers, old men and young boys, free blacks, ordinary Americans. A British officer would write that he felt as if he were looking at a new race of men.
I rode post-haste from Nantes with the dispatches from America. I didn't have time to get off my horse when Franklin shouted to me, "Did Howe really take Philadelphia?" "Yes, sir," I said. And the poor gentleman sadly shook his head and was heading back to the house. I stopped him. "But, sir, I have greater news than that. General Burgoyne and his whole army are prisoners of war." The effect was electrical.
This is Franklin's moment of triumph. Saratoga has changed everything. He is finally received by the French court.
To Catherine Green, your troubles will not last much longer. We have formed a treaty with the French. This alliance will serve to keep the English bull quiet and make him behave himself. His horns have been shortened. Benjamin Franklin.
The Americans now have as their ally one of the great superpowers of the world. For the British, it is a different story. They now face the prospect of a world war.
From the point of view of the British government, that meant a real war against a real enemy, an enemy that spoke a foreign language, a dangerous enemy, an enemy that might invade, an enemy that might overthrow the kingdom. Not just troublesome political issues, not just expensive and complex colonial problems, but real serious mortal peril.
December 1779. The war in America has been going on for 5 years and is at a stalemate. For England, it has expanded into a world war with her archenemy France. British colonies around the world are under attack, and France seems poised to invade England itself. The American war has become a costly sideshow. The British are growing desperate. General Henry Clinton sets sail from New York. He leaves behind a garrison of troops to tie down Washington's army. His destination is Charleston, South Carolina, the commercial and political center of the American Lower South.
The decision to go south was really a last attempt. They'd failed in New England, they'd failed in the middle colonies, as they regarded them, and where else could they go? The answer was that they could attempt to go south that they could pacify the entire South and then use that as a springboard from which they could reconquer the rest of the colonies.
Clinton lays siege to Charleston. The entire Southern Division of the American Army defends the city valiantly for 6 weeks. But in May, Charleston falls to the British. 16-year-old Eliza Wilkinson keeps a diary recording the events of the day.
A day of sorrow. I have seen my countrymen bound and dragged away. So many young men have died in her defense. Now America must fall. We are entirely at the mercy of the British soldiers. Even women are being sent to the prison ships. Do the Britons think that they'll conquer America this way? We may be led, but we'll never be driven.
The entire Southern Army is captured. Most of South Carolina falls into British hands. Georgia has been pacified, and North Carolina will soon follow. A delighted General Clinton reports back to London.
With greatest pleasure, I report to your lordship that inhabitants from every quarter rush to declare their allegiance to the king. I may venture to assert that there are few men in South Carolina who are not either in arms with us or our prisoners.
Since the beginning of the war, the British have issued 2 extraordinary proclamations offering protection to slaves who run away from their patriot masters.
They gave the African Americans the knowledge that they could become involved in this war, and that force could work toward their own freedom. They could work among the British, they would have occupations, they were paid by the British, and the march from plantations to the Clinton forces was for them a freedom march.
We ask for nothing more than is our right. We are the creatures of that God who made all nations of the earth of one blood and one kindred. We are no more obliged to serve you than you to serve us. The more we consider the matter, the more we are convinced we were not created to be slaves.
It became very apparent to British military leadership that racial manipulation might be used successfully to bring white Southerners to heel. It created widespread panic among white Southerners because every Southerner, whether he or she was a slave owner or a non-slave owner, feared the prospect of a massive slave uprising. They all felt their own vulnerability.
A Negro man named Charles ran off from me last night. I believe he intends to try to get to the British. He may prove resolute and daring if endeavored to be taken. His leaving was from no cause of complaint or dread of a whipping, for he has always been remarkably indulged. Indeed, too much so. But from a determination to get his liberty by flying to the British. He's very black, has a large nose, and is about 5 feet 8 or 10 inches high. I will give £5 to any person who secures him.
The British see the proclamations as a powerful weapon to destabilize the South. But the Patriots are determined to hold on to their slaves. They unite in opposition to the British.
And so in a great irony, the retention of this slave system becomes a significant objective of the revolution in the South. So we have a revolution in behalf of freedom and independence, and part of the freedom and independence is the maintenance of the slave system.
Washington has one great hope: his alliance with the French. King Louis's money is sustaining the war effort, and France is now America's principal source of military supplies: muskets, gunpowder, even uniforms. The American army is flooded with idealistic foreign volunteers, many of them noblemen. The German Baron Wilhelm von Steuben, the Polish Colonel Tadeusz Kosciuszka, Count Casimir Pulaski. The most famous of them is a young, enthusiastic, and very well-connected French aristocrat named Marie-Joseph Paul Yves Roch Gilbert du Motier. Americans know him as the Marquis de Lafayette. At age 19, Lafayette had become one of Washington's most trusted aides. He has returned to France to promote support for the revolution and writes Washington frequently.
Be so kind, mon cher général, as to present my best respects to your lady. Do not tell her, but I have a wife who is madly in love with you. Well, my feelings for you are too strong, but I can't object to her feelings. And indeed, all of Europe wants to see you so much that I have boldly affirmed that you will pay me a visit after the peace is settled. Oh, mon cher général, how happy I will be to embrace you again.
Washington's royal admirer, Lafayette, is a young man of royal birth with liberal politics and what Jefferson later called a canine appetite for fame. Someone said he was a statue in search of a pedestal. But he was intoxicated with a love, a rather theoretical love, of liberty. It was theoretical because liberty wasn't known to many Europeans. But he was a great romantic, and he fell in love with America, the concept of America that the French had, this wild new world where you could start the world over, to use Tom Paine's phrase. And he came to America, and he became, in effect, a surrogate son to Washington.
I think that Washington, when he met Lafayette, was charmed by this Gallic joie de vivre, by this very exaggeration and exuberance that this very young Lafayette, he was only 19 when he arrived in America, had. And I'm sure Lafayette had the best possible influence on loosening up Washington.
My dear Marquis, you invite me to visit France after independence. Remember, my friend, I don't speak your language, and I am too old to learn it. I cannot bear the idea that I would appear awkward and insipid in front of the ladies, especially in front of your young wife. Convey to her, in any event, my most tender affection, and don't be afraid of a rival. Alas, in all of history, there's no example of a young woman preferring an old man if she follows her own real inclinations. George Washington.
Lafayette meets with Louis XVI and secures for Washington what he most wants from the king, a regiment of French troops to be sent to America. Lafayette fully expects to be the commander of this army. He is disappointed when King Louis chooses instead a far more experienced general, Count Jean-Baptiste de Rochambeau. Rochambeau is horrified by what he finds in America.
To the Prince de Montbarret, Minister of War. Monsieur, the country is ruined. They have nothing, not a single coin. Washington's army grows and shrinks from moment to moment. Sometimes he claims he has 15,000 troops, sometimes only 3,000. Send men, money, and ships. But don't count on any help from these people.
Rochambeau and his 6,000 soldiers station themselves at Newport, Rhode Island, and wait for reinforcements. Privately, Rochambeau is convinced that the Americans are near defeat. He had pinned his hopes on the French, but they have done nothing. Lafayette, now back in America, urges General Rochambeau to take action.
Monsieur le Comte, here I find myself in the middle of a foreign land with the French army sitting idle in Rhode Island. The talk among the Tories and the English is that France has come to stir up fire but not fight themselves. How am I to answer them when you are guarding an island that nobody in America cares about? Whatever troops you are expecting next year from France, whatever plans you have for the future will not make up for the fatal harm of your inaction now. We must do battle. And my vanity makes me believe that we French can never be beaten.
Rochambeau finds Lafayette's proposal less than appealing.
My dear fellow, I'll let you in on one of my great secrets, learned from years of experience. Frenchmen aren't invincible. Our troops are easily beaten when they lose confidence in their leaders. And they do it very quickly, when they see that their lives are being risked to satisfy some general's personal ambition. Perhaps the warmth of your spirit has, for the moment, gotten the better part of your sound judgment. Keep this fire for when we actually go into battle.
Then, on August 14th, events take a sudden and surprising turn. Rochambeau receives a bulletin from the French Admiral Count de Grasse in the Caribbean. He immediately passes the news to Washington.
Count de Grasse will be arriving in the Chesapeake area with 29 warboats, 3,000 troops, several dozen field guns, and 1,200,000 pounds in cash. Because of obligations in the islands, this force will be available to us only until October 15th. We must make use of it promptly and efficiently.
De Grasse's ships and troops will be coming to Virginia, close to where Cornwallis is camped. Because hurricane season is approaching, they will be available for 2 weeks only. Washington leaps into action. Coordinating with Rochambeau, he makes plans to rush their best troops south to Virginia to meet up with de Grasse's fleet.
The French and the Americans are planning an operation in order to destroy the British position in Yorktown. Now, they know that the only way to do that successfully is a combined operation, and a combined operation is incredibly difficult. It means you've got to have the troops and the ships and also the seaborne artillery, which is another crucial element of it because the artillery is too heavy to move overland. And they've all got to arrive in the same area to provide a local superiority on force, both on land and at sea, at the same moment.
Washington and Rochambeau begin a month-long march south. Lafayette is camped in Williamsburg, near Yorktown. He sends Washington detailed reports.
Lord Cornwallis is entrenching at Yorktown. He is picking up whatever provisions he can get from the surrounding countryside. He has a large quantity of Negroes in town with him. They are working day and night on the fortifications. The moment I can get the plans, I will send them to you.
The French Admiral Count de Grasse arrives on schedule at the Virginia Capes. He is met by a fleet of British ships coming to Cornwallis's aid. They engage in a fierce 2-hour battle. Outnumbered, the British fleet retreats to New York for reinforcements. When Washington and Rochambeau arrive outside of Yorktown, the French Navy controls the Chesapeake. Rochambeau sends his greetings to de Grasse.
I must confess, you are, mon cher Amiral, the most wonderful admiral that I know. You have surpassed everything we could want. Now we are preparing for our own equally good piece of work. Tomorrow we will move as close as possible to Yorktown. And then our troops will just wait for the pear to ripen. We will, of course, yield precedence to the Americans. We will allow them to claim the victory.
Cornwallis's troops are camped on the river's edge. Facing them are the Allied French and American armies. To their rear, de Grasse's fleet.
They have blockaded Chesapeake Bay. Cornwallis can get no reinforcements. He really can't move around because you can send ships up virtually any river in Virginia and cut him off. So he's penned in there, he can't get out. And the Allies have Chesapeake Bay as a giant superhighway to bring men and guns and food and all the other things necessary to fight a battle.
This is the moment that Washington has been waiting for. The Allies command 17,000 troops. The British, only 9,000. Washington's troops are ready for action. In the 5 years of the war, They have become the disciplined army he has always wanted. Among the soldiers is a young man who had fought in the first major battle of the Revolution as a raw recruit. Joseph Plum Martin is now a seasoned veteran of numerous campaigns.
They told us that we're about to pay a visit to our old friends, the British. Their accommodations are cramped, and I fear that they're not ready to receive so many visitors, but we've come such a long way to see them. We're just not going to be put off by their excuses.
Cornwallis sends a dispatch to Clinton, suggesting that he hurry up the reinforcements. Clinton replies that rescue is on the way.
5,000 soldiers are on the King's ships. Joint operations will commence in a few days to relieve you.
While they wait, Cornwallis's men furiously dig trenches in preparation for the Allied assault. His black auxiliaries do much of the heavy labor.
Working hard in the heat. The works will soon be in a tolerable state of defense. The army is in good health. We have 6 weeks' provisions.
The French and Americans prepare for a siege. They dig trenches encircling the town. Rochambeau, an expert at siege warfare, guides the activities. The British soldiers watch with increasing alarm.
I try to warn the Earl of the weakness of our defenses. I show him how I can just jump over the earthworks. It will disgrace our army to fall in a siege. If that happens, he answers coldly. The blame will be on Clinton, not on us.
The bombardment of Yorktown now begins in earnest. The French cannon pound the British defenses day and night. When the British are weak enough, the Allies advance their lines, bringing the cannon ever closer.
It's almost an exercise in mathematics in which you aim to break up the enemy's attack and you want to get it so you can shoot at him from as many sides as possible. So it's a very structured and formal activity, much like the way that a boa constrictor deals with its victims. They grasp them, weaken them, let up a little, and then grasp them tighter until eventually they have their dinner. And a siege is like that. Once one is properly undertaken, unless there is some outside intervention, the people besieging the town are going to win.
The siege began. It lasted week after week. And as it lasted, Cornwallis's provisions began to grow very short. In order to prevent his horses from starving to death, they had to be slaughtered and thrown into the river.
And he did with the African Americans something very similar to what he did with the horses. His men were starving, and they wanted every ounce of food for his men, and so they simply drove them out of the camp.
The black auxiliaries are forced into the no man's land between the fighting armies.
It's harsh. Our black friends have served our army well, and now we drive them out by force between firing guns. Now they will have to face the reward of their cruel masters. No, I can't talk about what we are doing to them.
The Americans and French position themselves to advance on the British outer defenses.
The password for tonight is the name of the French commander, Rochambeau. Easy to remember, Rochambeau. And it sounds just like Rush on, boys. The signal is given. We silently move on the redoubts, bayonets fixed. The enemy sees us and begins firing. hear people crying, "The redoubts are ours!" There's no stopping us. In we go. It really is. Rush on, boys.
By now, the Americans and French are just outside the final barricades. Yorktown is ready to be taken. On the 17th of October, 1781, the British send up a flag of truce.
Needless to say, the victorious colonials are in a mood to celebrate and to rub in their victory. Washington, the consummate actor, dramatically appears on a charger, riding up and down the American lines, forbidding them to engage in any demonstration, and shouting, "Posterity will huzzah for us."
The play is over. The fifth act has ended. I must confess I was a bit uneasy during the first 4 acts, but my heart keenly enjoyed this last one.
French. Their faces darken. They look like boys who've been whipped at school.
On October 24th, a huge British fleet arrives off the Chesapeake Capes. Clinton has made good on his promise, but it is 1 week too late. The French fleet has returned to the Caribbean. Cornwallis and his entire army are prisoners of the Americans. Yorktown is the biggest British disaster since Saratoga. The news reaches British essayist Horace Walpole.
Ah, yes, Cornwallis. That Columbus who was to bestow America on us again. For us to lose a second army, now this is an achievement. Well, here ends another volume in the American War. I would suggest that it's all over, but for the fact that there are 3 other wars that have grown out of it, and we're £40 million in debt.
It is not immediately obvious that the war is over. The English still hold New York, Charleston, and Savannah. With the French Navy out of the way, the British again rule the sea. But the British have bet everything on victory in the South. They must now accept that this is a war they can never really win. In Tom Paine's words, they cannot conquer an idea with an army.
British popular opinion, which had been so strongly in favor of the war at the beginning, had turned heavily, and as it turned out, irrevocably against the government. It's the same thing with other wars, of course. Long wars bring higher taxes, bring economic crisis, bring an interruption of trade, decline of property prices, and so on. All these things, and especially the fact that the war had become a world war against France, all of them created a crisis which public opinion would no longer tolerate.
Yorktown brings down the government. The opposition takes over, committed to ending the war. In 1783, 2 years after the defeat at Yorktown, a treaty is signed in Paris. The British signatories decline to pose for the official portrait. King George tries to console himself.
America seems to be a land of knaves. In the end, perhaps it is for the best that its inhabitants have become aliens to this kingdom.
But it is observed that when he announces the terms of the American treaty to Parliament, his voice chokes when he says the word independence.
The old man, our captain, came in and handed us our discharge papers. We didn't say much. And we've lived together for 8 years. Young men with warm hearts, through hardships, dangers. A family of brothers. And now never to see each other again. It's a sad time. And by now everyone's heard the old story of the soldiers tracking the blood of their feet on the frozen ground. It literally happened. But you don't know 1,000th part of how we suffered. You never can.